The Prophet Muhammad started to receive divine revelations in the year 610 of the Common Era, and he continued to do so over a span of 22 years until the end of his life. He conveyed these revelations to the people around him in the form of recitations, which is the literal meaning of the word Qur'an. These recitations were memorized, gathered together, and ultimately recorded in writing in the years following his demise. Due to the elevated language and style of the Qur'an, right from the time of revelation or soon after, different interpretations emerged of how the believers were to apply the principles of the revelation under different circumstances and in different geographical locations. In this lecture, Dr. Omar Ali-de-Unzaga discusses the multitude of interpretations of the Qur'an that exist.
It is remarkable that many of these interpretations have been in coexistence for more than 1,000 years, even today. Drawing on a number of a few examples, I will argue that it is important for Muslims and non-Muslims to be familiar with what I would call venerable history of interpretation of the Quran, not only as a historical phenomenon, but also as a key to make sense of today's turbulent world. So I will divide the lecture into 4 parts. I will say some words on the Quran itself. I will then spend some time talking about the literary genre of Quranic commentary, tafsir. I will then look at some examples from actual verses on the Quran, which we will read, and we will visit how they have been interpreted. And then at the end I will offer some comments by way of conclusions. The key points I want to emphasize today are as follows. A number of points, but I would summarize them into 3. 1, that the Quran is to be understood as a process, not as a product. I will explain this. That it should be considered in its own time. That it has specificities and universality as well. 2, that the exegetical tradition, that is the tradition of commentary on the Quran, is in itself a product of its time. However, some of these interpretations have crystallized as dogma. They have become dogma, as if the interpretation is the text, as if the interpretation is the Quran. Meaning is not certain. Meaning is never certain. In linguistics, meaning is not certain. It is up for interpretation. 3, that Muslims must confront their own plural tradition, and others, meaning non-Muslims, must be familiar with their own intellectual history, as well as the complexities of Muslim intellectual history. I am convinced that these elements will play an important role if we want to solve many of the problems that we are facing today. So, a kind of shared responsibility about knowing about each one's own history and the other's history. So, some reflections on the Quran. I want to start with a blunt assertion, which is the Quran is not a book. Traditionally, when we think of the Quran, the definition of the Quran, the dictionary definition of the Quran is the sacred book of Muslims. Of course it's a book, we know it. I have a translation here. What I mean is, in order to do justice to the text, as we would do with any other sacred text or any other text, we have to see it in the making. By this I mean we have to do some mental deconstruction of the word Quran. When we think of Quran, we think of a capital Q, Al-Quran, an object, which you can pick up and turn the pages and read. This is far, far, far from the Qur'an in the making. If Qur'an means recitation, means oral recitation, then surely, even though the Qur'an itself calls itself a book, you might argue, why are you saying it's not a book when it calls itself a book? Well, we have to think about what book means in the 7th century. The word in Arabic, kitab, for book, means writing. It doesn't necessarily mean a book as we understand it today. It can be any writing. But I think that the word that best explains the term book as used in the Quran itself is the word scripture. Scripture, yes, it has to do with writing, but it has a higher meaning, as if it was a cosmic meaning. In fact, the Quran sometimes refers to something that many commentators have described as the celestial Quran, the eternal Quran, the eternal book, the eternal kitab, by which not only the Quran is meant, but also the other books, the other revealed books. So the Quran refers to the book as a concept, the concept of divine revelation, which of course became written later on. Why we should not look at the Quran as a book? Because then when we consider the Quran as a book, we look at the post-Quranic history. And I want to invite you to look at the Quran during its making, during the lifetime of the speaker of the Quran, the deliverer of the Quran, that is the Prophet Muhammad. Sometimes a verse of the Quran says something, and the contemporaries of Muhammad said, what does that mean? And there would be another revelation, and that would be also part of the Quran. This means that the Quran interacted with history. It was not a product that came and it was written. It was, the making of the Quran was the making of the interaction with life, with what was going on. So we must understand what the context in which it was revealed. A second point I want to emphasize is that the Quran contains specific points. Let me give you one example. One verse of the Quran says, it is not virtue that you should enter from the back of your house, from the back door. To be virtuous is to believe in God and to be a good person and to help the poor, etc., etc. And so you might think, why is it saying that virtue is not entering through the back door? Well, according to the commentary tradition, this is because the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, believed that when you came back from a journey and you entered your house through the front door, that would bring you bad luck. So you had to go through the back door. That was a custom. And that the Arabs called that piety. Taqwa, piety. To be a religious person, you had to do such things. And the Quran says, no. What you do, the act that you do of entering through the back, that is not virtue. Virtue is to help the poor and to be a good person for the society. So in this verse, at the same time you have something very specific to the context, but at the same time something which can be called universal. That virtue is not something that has to do with specific traditions, but has to do with improving the life of your fellow beings and taking care of the poor, etc., etc. So that's an example of how the Quran itself can be specific of something which happened in 7th century Arabia and cannot be understood without knowing that context, but also being universal or potentially universal. Many times when something happens, even in the contemporary world, people in the media, Muslims, non-Muslims, we go to the Quran and we ask the question, what does the Quran say about killing of innocents, or divorce, or refugees, I don't know, whatever. And to me the question is not what the Quran says about something, but what was the context in which it was said. Decontextualizing something is taking it somewhere else, giving it a new life. It will not be the Quran, it will be something different. And that is what has been happening for 1,400 years. And the second question that I would ask, rather than what the text says, is what are the multiple interpretations of that particular verse and that particular circumstance of revelation? I hope that with the examples later we will see this illustrated a bit better. One example of how later interpretations impose on the original text their own preoccupations of later centuries is one verse of the Quran where God says, I have prescribed on myself mercy, meaning I have to be merciful. That's what it says. The theologians scratch their heads. What does God mean? If God prescribes upon himself mercy, it means that he can only be merciful and he cannot not be merciful. And this is the theological mind thinking, not the Quranic speech. The theologian thinking, God cannot be limited. God is free. God should be free because God is perfect and God is universal and God can do whatever he wants. And so the theologian is at odds with reading a verse that says that God prescribes upon himself mercy. And many theologians were uncomfortable and they had to justify that he really meant that he is merciful, but he can be non-merciful to those who are evil. But this is how theologians work. This is how the logical mind tries to solve the apparent contradictions in the text. So those who defended free will, that man is free to do what he wants, would say God cannot be unjust. God must be bound by the laws of justice, cosmic, universal justice if you want, but God is bound by that. A group of theologians in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries who are known for being rationalist theologians called the Mu'tazilis, they argued this. They said, God must be just. He cannot be unjust. Because they said that in order for man to be free, God has to create man free so that man chooses between good and evil, and then God judges according to the choice. And if man makes the choice of good, God rewards with paradise, and if man makes the choice of evil, God punishes with hellfire. Therefore, God has to give freedom to man. Why did these theologians think this? Because they said that I'm speaking about theologians, but theology does not happen on the heavens. Theology happens on the earth. And there's always a geopolitical context to theology. The rationalist theologians of this group, they wanted to call the caliphs, the rulers, to account and say the ruler is responsible for what he does. And therefore, if a ruler is unjust, the society can ask for responsibility. In today's world, we would say we can ask for their resignation. This is not something that they would ask from the caliph. But the caliphs were very uncomfortable with this. Another group of theologians believed that God cannot be constrained by anything, not even by justice or love or goodness. that God is beyond human capability. And no matter what we say about God, that will be only human language. And therefore, we have to believe that if God says in the Quran, because God says in the Quran that those who don't believe have a lock in their hearts and they will not believe, then the rationalists would say, well, we have to understand that metaphorically, because God must give you freedom to choose if He is just. And because He can only be just, He has to give you freedom. The other group said, who are the Ash'arites, who in the end they won the debate and they dominate the Sunni world until today. So the Al-Azhar University in Cairo follows this theology, that God is free from these constraints and He can not allow someone to be good and yet punish them. Anyway, these are theological questions, medieval questions, but all the Quran says is, I have prescribed upon myself mercy. So you can see how 5 or 6 words with probably the intention of creating an effect to show to the audience, to the live audience of the Prophet, that God is merciful, has generated all of these complex theologies which have to do with the geopolitics of the time and the disagreements between the different groups. So why does this happen then? And what to do with such relativism? As many of you will know, in the early history of Islam, once the Prophet dies, there is an initial division between those who believe that the Prophet appoints a successor, being Ali, his cousin, and his supporters are the Shia Muslims. In fact, they are called Shiat Ali, the supporters of Ali. And there are those who do not agree with this and think that, well, the Prophet is gone and now we must select our leader from within a small group of elders, and they select someone else as a caliph. Nevertheless, Ali is selected in time as the 4th caliph. So he is accepted by his Shia, by his followers, as well as the rest of the Muslims. Except for one group. There is one group who, as the sources say, they move away. And they are called those who moved away, the Kharijis. And there are some disputes, territorial disputes, and disputes of authority, really. And they said, we will not agree, we do not agree with you as a leader, and we don't agree with you, Ali. We only obey the Quran. And they took pages of the Quran. It's not that they tear them off. These were manuscript parchment pages, and they put them in their spears. And they said, we only obey the Quran. And Ali famously said to them, you want to know what the Quran says? Talk to me. I am the speaking Quran. If you ask the book, it will not answer. If you ask me, I will answer. I am the speaking Quran, and that is the silent Quran. This is a very important principle for the Shia, that the guidance of the revelation continues in the person of the Imam. So in his dealing with this rebel group, we could call them the Kharijis, he sends a companion of the Prophet, Ibn Abbas, who is also related to the Prophet, to negotiate with the rebels. And he says, yes, I'm going to negotiate with them. I'm going to quote this verse. I'm going to say to them, you have no right because the Quran says this and that and that. And Ali gives him a piece of advice. And he says, I'm translating directly from the Arabic, do not confront them with the Quran, because the Quran is the bearer of many faces, aspects, and it has different aspects. You will say something, and they will reply something, meaning you will quote a verse from the Quran, and they will quote another verse from the Quran, defending their opinion. So that will take you nowhere. He said, instead, argue with the example of the life of the Prophet, and they will have no escape from that. Anyway, I'm bringing this example to say that already from the first generations of Muslims who knew the Prophet, who had witnessed the revelation, the performance of the revelation, if you want, the delivery of the revelation through the mouth of the Prophet Muhammad life, already those people argued about the interpretation. And Ali famously says, be careful with confronting people with using arguments of the Quran, because you can find anything you want in the Quran, because it has many different aspects. Let me bring you to the 20th century and relate to what a mathematician and philosopher from England, Alfred North Whitehead, said. He was talking about nature in a book written in 1933. And he said, nature, he's thinking about the concept of nature for mathematics, but also for philosophy. Nature is a patient of interpretation in terms of laws which happen to interest us. So he's saying, nature is not something which is out there. It's something which is out there that we interpret. It's a patient of interpretation. And I think there is a link between this 20th century idea of something as being a patient of interpretation and Ali's saying in the 7th century that the Quran has many different facets that can be interpreted differently. Later, a literary critic, also British, Frank Kermode, in 1959, said that he built on this on philosopher Whitehead's idea. He said that being a patient of interpretation is an attribute of classic texts. So the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Bible, and I would like to add the Quran. Why? Because I think that the Quran should not be appropriated by Muslims. There are a number of researchers nowadays who are considering the Quran in what is called either late antiquity or the first millennium. The first millennium is a new concept in historiography, which is being discussed as being a tool that helps us understand how things happened in the Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Europe in the beginning of the end of the classical world, the beginning of Christianity, and the beginning of Islam. Traditionally in the West, classical antiquity and the beginning of Christianity are studied, but the beginning of Islam is not studied in this context. And many historians are calling to revise this and to also study the beginning of Islam as part of late antiquity. This is a very fruitful way of studying Islam, because this is what we call the continuum of history. It's a line. Usually Muslims, in their own education, when they teach and they convey education on Islam to their children, they start with Islam or pre-Islamic Arabia. But very rarely do they go further back. So both Western education and the education within Muslim communities are starting, one is stopping at a certain point and the other one is starting at one point without considering the continuum of the history. And there are so many ideas which happen in late antiquity, in the Greco-Roman world, and the way Christianity became a liberating religion from the Middle East, and then it became an oppressed religion in Rome, and then it became the state religion of an empire. to how Islam began. So anyway, I leave these reflections with you. On a related note, I may add that the Quran is not revealed for Muslims. The Quran does not address Muslims. The Quran addresses the people. It addresses mankind, or you people, it says. Or it addresses believers. And if it addresses the word Muslims, Muslim does not mean in the Quran what we think is Muslims today. Today, Muslim is someone who belongs to a certain community with a certain history. Muslim literally means someone who has submitted his heart to the authority of the Prophet and has accepted the message. It didn't have any connotations of how they prayed, or where they prayed, or what they looked, or what they wore, or what they ate. So therefore, words have a history as well. And so if you read the Quran and it says, all believers or all Muslims, that word does not mean Muslims today. It means all you who have accepted this message. And they may have been Christians, they may have been Jews, they may have been pagans. So take this into consideration. A claim to make the Quran a classic that should be studied, it should be read in all schools in the world, together with its commentaries. Like the English study their Shakespeare and the Italians study their Divine Comedy and, etc. I think we need this today. Now, moving on. A couple of words on interpretation. As with any other religion, there is a tradition of scholars who come along and comment on the founding text of the religion. In the Arabic Islamic culture, this is called tafsir. Tafsir means to explain. So what the scholars would do is they would sit down and they would not need to read the Quran because they would have memorized it completely since they were children. So they would have it in their minds and they would start reciting. They would write one verse and they would explain that verse. They would write the second verse and they would write the explanation of the second verse, and sometimes of each individual word, and sometimes the grammar of each word, and sometimes the history of the grammar of each word, and sometimes bringing poetry from the pre-Islamic time to explain what that meant. So a very sophisticated system of interpretation. This is what is called exegesis. In the history of commenting on the Quran, Muslims developed what they came to call the disciplines of the Quran, or the sciences of the Quran, ulum al-Quran. Among these, I can highlight a number of them. One of the sub-genres of commentary was a commentary on the nature of the language of the Quran. Some Muslims, in fact, the expression some Muslims is a very healthy expression. And a non-healthy expression is Muslims. Muslims believe this. Muslims believe that. You will have to ask who, when, and for each period there will be a number of views. So be very careful when you say Muslims believe that. So some Muslims believed that the language of the Quran was inimitable because no human could produce something like that. Others believed that the language of the Quran was inimitable because God did not allow anybody to produce anything like that, etc., etc. This is what's called the inimitability of the Quran. Of course, non-Muslims would say, there is nothing inimitable about your Quran. It's a normal text. And so Muslims would feel offended and would say, no, it's inimitable because it's divine. And so in order to prove that it was a superior text, they would need to engage in literary analysis to prove that it was inimitable. Prove with inverted commas. So a large number of books were developed, were written to prove the wonder of the language of the Quran. Another debate was whether, and these debates happened during the interpretation of the Quran, whether the Quran is, believe it or not, it's not a relevant debate today. It might seem like the discussing the sex of the angels in the history of the Byzantines. Whether the Quran is created or whether the Quran is eternal. The rationalist philosophers, the theologians that I referred to earlier, the Mu'tazilis, believed that the Quran was created, that it was created in time, that it was created as it was made. The opponents, the Asharis, said this cannot be the case, because this means that if God is creating the Quran as Muhammad interacts with his contemporaries, then God is saying something that he didn't know about, and this is not possible. He must have known about this from eternity. So he must have created it from eternity. The rationalist philosophers said, if you argue that the Quran is created from eternity, then the Quran and God are co-eternal, and that is not compatible with our view of God. So again, you have another convoluted and complex theological debate. Believed that God could be seen. Other Muslims believed that it was impossible for God to be seen because of the nature of the divine. It has to be spirit. How can you see it? And therefore, they would go to the Quran and say, but the Quran says that he saw him. So God cannot be lying. And therefore we have the debate on metaphorical language. Does the Quran, does the language of Scripture, the Quran and other scriptures, use metaphorical language to refer to the divine, or does he use transparent language that must be believed the way it is? So some theologians would say the vision of God is a metaphor for a state of the soul. Beatific vision, if you want. And other theologians would say that is rubbish. We will see God in the afterlife, but we don't know how. We will not ask how. These are the Asharis. We will accept what the Quran says without asking how. And this became a phrase, bila kaif, without any how. They accepted what it said. There were many other groups. Some other Muslims believed that God had a body. Why? Because the Quran says, God says in the Quran that God has hands. God places his hands on the hands of the people. And God sits on the throne. He cannot be lying, so he must have a throne. So even though these debates might seem a bit childish to us, a bit, not a bit rudimentary to us, they were very important because these were the first centuries of Muslim theology, discussing on what was the vision of, what was their conceptualization of the divine. And I often say that your God is the God that you imagine, is the God of your image. So if you have a God who is incredibly merciful and forgives anything at the end of time, then that says something about who you are. And if you have a God who does not forgive and is very terrible, then surely that says something about the theology that is producing that God, that image of the God. Resurrection was another debate. Does resurrection, as you can see, as we go along the debates, we cannot say that Muslims believed A or B. There were many, many views. And sometimes I'm reducing them to just a debate between two groups. Resurrection. Some Muslims believed that God will physically take your body and lifted up, put you straight, and there will be some kind of judgment in some physical place, and that will be it. And it happens in body. And these are also debates which happen in Judaism and in Christianity. And other Muslims believed that this was metaphorical, and the resurrection was a metaphor for resurrecting the knowledge of the soul. So, again, philosophy and theology coming into place. An important branch of Quranic commentary is its applications in law. The Quran is not a book of law, first because the Quran is not a book, but anyway, it's not something about law. The Quran contains more than 6,000 verses. Some 600 could be considered as giving norms, laws. And these are about marriage, divorce, inheritance, punishments, and war and peace. There's nothing about international law, there's nothing about banking or economy. So it's a kind of personal type of basic legal principles. And even here, there were difference of interpretations. So you have a whole, with one simple verse of the Quran that talks about inheritance, how much should the children and the daughters of someone inherit when they die? Only that one verse, which says, it gives a formula. There are at least 10 interpretations. I read an article recently about those 10 interpretations, which give different amounts and different portions of inheritance to the daughters and the sons because of the interpretation of the language. So even in matters of law, the interpretation of the language was very important. An important aspect, which is important to the way many mystics saw Islam, was that there were different levels of understanding of the Quran. And there are many sayings or hadiths attributed to the companions of the Prophet, the Imams of the Shia, and the Prophet himself, as saying that the Quran contains various levels. And one of these divisions of the levels is that the Quran contains two levels, an outer level and an inner level, what we call the Zahir and the Batin. Another definition of the levels of the Quran is that the Quran contains rules and regulations which should be known by everybody. It contains predictions of the future which are only known to God. It contains metaphors which should be interpreted. And it contains, I think, verses on punishment. And there are various other definitions of the levels. Let me move on to the examples. I want to read to you three verses. The first verse is from Surah, the third Surah of the Quran. The surahs in the Quran as we have it are not arranged chronologically. So the third Surah is not the third Surah in chronological order. It's just the third Surah. They are organized by size, from larger to smaller, more or less. It says, "In the name of God, merciful to all, compassionate to each. God, there is no God but He, everlasting, ever living. He sent down to you, Muhammad, He sent down to you the book with the truth, confirming His previous scriptures. And He sent down the Torah and the Evangel beforehand, a guidance to mankind. And He sent down the criterion between good and evil. Those who blaspheme against the revelations of God shall meet with terrible torment. God is almighty, vengeful. From God nothing is hidden on earth and in heaven. It is He who gives you shapes in wombs and in any manner he pleases. There is no God but he, Almighty, all-wise. It is he who sent down the book upon you. In it are verses precise in meaning. These are the very mother of the book, al-Kitab. Others are ambiguous. Those in whose heart is deviance pursue what is ambiguous therein, seeking discord and seeking to unravel its interpretation. But no one knows its interpretation except, and now there are two ways of reading this. A group of Muslims, mostly the Sunnis, but not all the Sunnis, read, but no one knows its interpretation except God. And those deeply rooted in knowledge say, we believe in it. Now the Shia, they read it in a different way, because Arabic has no punctuation. Punctuation is an invention, modern typography, European typography. The Shia read, but no one knows its interpretation except God and those deeply rooted in knowledge, who say, we believe in it. All is from our Lord. In the Shia tradition, those deeply rooted in knowledge are the Imams of the Ali line, of course. But not all the Sunnis read it this way. Some Sunnis read it as, no one knows its interpretation except God and those who are firmly rooted in knowledge. And they say, the scholars are those firmly rooted in knowledge. So they give themselves the right to interpret. Now this verse is curious in that the Quran is talking about itself. So the revelation from God is talking about itself, the revelation of God. And the revelation of God is talking about people who interpret it and misinterpret it. This is unique. This does not happen in any other scripture. In fact, there is a high level of what has been called self-referentiality in the Quran, self-awareness. Because it is precisely during the time of the revelation that the people who didn't accept the call of the Prophet were arguing against it and were saying, this is false. And the Quran gives us some kind of hint that people were interpreting things in the wrong way. So the Quran itself says that there are verses which are clear and verses which are ambiguous. Now you can imagine the confusion of the theologian is like, okay, there are verses which are clear and verses which are ambiguous. So is this verse clear or ambiguous? And which verses are clear and which verses are ambiguous? And that's what they did. They went through the Quran and saying, okay, this is clear, so you must follow this. And this is ambiguous, so we will interpret it. So the whole reading of the Quran is covered by an exegetical exercise about interpreting. Now, this is to put you into the mood. I have a very important verse which has caused a lot of controversy. The beginning is a bit like the previous verse, but you will see that there's one part which is very important. This is in the second surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the surah of the cow, verse 255 onwards. God, there is no God but He, living, everlasting. Neither slumber overtakes Him, nor sleep. To Him belongs what is in the heavens and what is on earth. Who shall intercede with Him except by His leave? He knows the present affairs and their past, and they do not grasp of His knowledge except what He wills. His throne encompasses the heavens and the earth. Preserving them is no burden to Him. He is the exalted, the majestic. There is no compulsion in religion. There is no compulsion in religion. Right guidance has been distinguished from error. Right. There is no compulsion in religion. We all wonder what ISIS is thinking about this verse, right? So, let's see what I can do in the last 5 minutes, as my colleagues are telling me. Now, Scholars have identified 13 interpretations of this verse, of this phrase. There is no compulsion in religion. Right? It would seem to you and me that it's clear. Well, not the case. Let me give you some interpretations grouped into centuries. 3 interpretations in the first 150 years. Okay? So, just to put into context, 150 years is you, your father and mother, grandfather and grandmother, great-grandfather and great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother. Okay? More or less. Number 1. One interpretation says, there is no compulsion in religion. This verse is not applicable because it has been abrogated by other verses. Because other verses say that you should wage the jihad, okay, and convert others. So, this is clearly in contradiction, and we think that this was revealed earlier. And I'm making a joke of this, but a lot of citations are brought, a lot of sources are brought, a lot of arguments are brought to say that this verse has been abrogated and it doesn't apply. Can you imagine theologians declaring a verse in the Quran as non-applicable? Today, nobody says this. Okay? Second interpretation. Well, yes, but let's look at the context in which this was revealed. Okay? And people say, so when was this revealed? And people start asking, do you remember? Oh, well, I think I heard my father saying that his grandfather said that so-and-so said that this was revealed in this city. Okay? And so one of these interpretations says that you may know that the Prophet Muhammad was from Mecca, and when his message meets the opposition of the Meccans, he is forced to flee to Medina, to another city which is called Yathrib. It's not called Medina, it's called Yathrib. And later on it's called Medinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. So he goes to Yathrib, and the people there, the Prophet comes and people accept him and they want to become Muslims. And some of the parents have children who are now adults and have become Christians and Jews, because there were Christians and Jews in Yathrib, in Medina, not so in Mecca. And they say, what do we do now? They are Christians and Jews and we want them to be Muslims. And they say, children, well, son, you have to be a Muslim now. And they say, I don't want to be a Muslim. You have to be a Muslim. And these commentators say, this verse was revealed for this. There is no compulsion in religion. You cannot convert them to Islam. They can stay as Muslims and Jews. And the same commentators say, but because this was revealed for those people, it's not applicable anymore. It's not, you cannot extrapolate it to anyone. You cannot do an analogy and say, well, now no Muslims and Jews can be converted. So it's almost like abrogated because it has been declared specific in time. Third interpretation. This is applicable only to Jews and Christians living under Muslim rule. So I hope I'm conveying to you that there is a rupture between the world of the Quran as it's coming and the world of the generations and generations of Muslims who are building an empire and are building a theology and are reflecting back on their text and then imposing back some meanings on the text which may not have been there. We don't know. Under Muslim rule, under the Islamic empire, Jews and Christians were allowed to continue to believe in their faiths as long as they paid a tax. And they were called protected communities. So these commentators say the protected communities cannot be forced to convert. Okay? These were called the demise. This is not something that the Islamic State is doing. So they're not even building on some of the traditions of the Muslim world. We will see. They are the 13th interpretation, by the way. Right. So we have 150 years. And then comes the 10th century. What is the 10th century? The 10th century is the peak. Is the peak of philosophy. is the peak of science, is the peak of optics, the peak of mathematics, the peak of astronomy, the peak of surgery. Okay? I did a little research as to what was happening in the 10th century in Europe. Okay? So, England was divided between the Danes, the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Okay, we're talking about fairly ancient history. No philosophy around. The Iberian Peninsula, the kingdom of Castile, had become independent. Abd al-Rahman III became emir of the Umayyads in Cordoba and then caliph of the Umayyads in Cordoba. Lisbon, Al-Ushbuna, was attacked by the Vikings. It was also attacked by the king of Leon. In America, the Mayan peoples had gone through the peak of the culture and they were in decline. In what is today the United States, the Pueblo peoples were developing their culture. In China, they invented fireworks. This is the 10th century. In Cairo, one of the first universities of the world was founded, Al-Azhar, by the Fatimids, the ancestors of the current Ismaili Imam. So, if you wanted to go somewhere to study in the 10th century, you would go to Cordoba, you would go to Cairo, you would go to Baghdad. You have to think about, London, New York, Leiden today. Theologians come and start thinking theologically, as we have been seeing, and they say, there is no compulsion in religion means that God cannot force you to believe. So they read things not in a prescriptive way as law, but in a descriptive way as theology. Fifth interpretation. Again, another group of theologians, also rationalist theologians. This is complicated because they believed that there is no compulsion in religion means that there is freedom of conscience. Be careful. It's not contemporary freedom of conscience. It was freedom of conscience. It was an inner freedom of conscience. As long as the person accepted the rule of the Muslims, as long as the person accepted the superiority of Islam, any Muslims or non-Muslims, they could have, theologically, freedom of conscience to believe what they wanted, but they had to follow what the Muslims said. And if you were a Muslim, you had to pray the way they said, and where they said, and you had to recite what they wanted you to hear. So it's a kind of division between the inner person and the outer person. So they came up with an inner type of freedom, which was not incompatible with a lack of freedom in the public sphere. Now, to understand this, you have to imagine that today, for example, somebody says, if you are a refugee and you come into a democratic society, you have to abide by the rules of society. Or if you come to France, you have to accept la laïcité. You have to become a citizen of France. You can believe what you want, but you have to become a citizen. So something like that. As long as you accept the law, which was the law of the empire, the law of the Muslims, you can believe what they want. That's a theological stance. Not an easy one to follow. Number 6. During the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, the badly called Reconquista anyway, one theologian, one commentator of the Quran said, there is no compulsion in religion means you Christians cannot convert us. Okay? So, what are they doing? They are applying. Interpretation is not only some kind of intellectual exercise. It's an application of something to your time. And this continues to happen today. We will see in a minute. Number 7. The Ismailis, our hosts. Now, the Ismailis were an exception, I'm glad to say. They believed in legal protection for individual religiosity. They did not believe that the law, I don't want to use the word Sharia, because Sharia today means something which is not. Sharia means the principles. Okay? It's not about stoning or cutting hands. Sharia is the principles of the revelation. The Ismailis believed that the law, following the rituals of the religion, does not give you salvation. And so they flirted with the rejection of the law. If the law doesn't give you salvation, why do you need it? But, as it happens, in the 10th century, the Ismailis became an empire. The Ismaili Imam became a ruler. From being simply a religious leader, became an emperor. And had to rule over Ismailis, very few, Sunnis of many different schools, Jews and Christians, of which there were many, many in Egypt. And they ruled from North Africa, from Morocco, what today is Morocco, Tunisia, today's Libya, Egypt, Syria, and even Mecca and Medina. So there was a big empire. And they came up with a notion that, yes, if you want civic religion, meaning a society ruled under a religious law, may be helpful for the citizen to improve themselves. But they established this law as an empire, which held that you could be a citizen of the empire and believe in your own religion. Okay? Put this way, it sounds very modern, but it wasn't that modern. Okay? But the Ismailis, anyway, they were an exception to this. They didn't make freedom of conscience only an internal matter. It was also an external matter, and it was protected by law. And I'm referring to the Fatimid Empire. Now, let's make a small jump to the 20th century. And in the 20th century, you have two things. You have colonialism, which is that almost no land inhabited by Muslims is free from a colonial power. Very few lands. Perhaps Iran is the only land without a colonial power dominating. And then you have post-colonialism. What can I say to the Portuguese? You know a lot about this. And then you have the regimes that come after colonialism. And these regimes tended to be ultra-secular. So you have two things happening. Ultra-secular regimes, which are often dictatorial, oppressive, etc., and they have ultra-secular ideology. And then you have the history of polemics between Muslims and Christians always going on. And the polemics of the Muslims against the Christians is, you have invented a God that has children and has a son, and you have perverted the scriptures, and you have become the one God, you have turned it into three. And the Christians always said to the Muslims, your religion is not spiritual, it's a religion of the sword. You have expanded your religion through the sword. And the Muslims were very offended by this. So in the modern time, we have what vaguely can be called modernists, modernist Muslims, who see in there is no compulsion in religion a kind of declaration of religious freedom, declaration of religious rights, so to speak. Mainly to refute the accusations that were coming from Europe, that your religion is, I don't know if you remember in 2006, the Pope had quoted a Christian theologian saying that Islam had spread through the sword, and many Muslims were very offended by this. So it's a position that was that is still lingering. So the modernists come up with a new interpretation, which is there is no compulsion in religion means that God does not force anybody to believe, and no man can force anybody else to believe other things than what they believe. Okay? Now, again, this sounds very ideal, but these modernists were very traditional, mainly based in Egypt, in Syria, and they were calling for some kind of modernization of Muslims without calling for a complete secular state. View number 9, full secularism. Some Muslims, starting from the 1940s, started to say that Muslims must believe, I cannot give you names and authors because this will complicate the matters, but there are sources that we can find the authors. Muslims, the true future for Muslims is that there is no compulsion in religion, means that nobody can force anybody to think anything. So, full secularism. There was a problem here. While this sounds like angels' music to a European ear, to a post-colonial person oppressed by an ultra-secular regime, often caught in the Cold War, people who wanted to have Islam in the public sphere, what we call today the Islamists, someone like Sayyid Qutb in the 1960s, he was involved in the assassination of the Egyptian president, and then he was hanged. He would say, we want religion in the public sphere, and we are oppressed by the secularist regime. So secular became the evil. And so they read, there is no compulsion in religion. It means you are compelling us to believe in your secularism. And you cannot do that. And we want to bring back Islam into they imagine this back to the past. Which past? We have seen that there are 13 pasts. So which one? It's an imagined one. And they came up with a slogan, which is today very popular. Islam is the solution. Islam is the solution. Islam is the solution. Yes, Islam is the solution. There was no program. There was nothing. It was just an opposition. But they brought this verse against the regimes, against Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, all the rest of them. Number 10. Some Islamists today, by Islamists I mean people who want Islam to be the official religion and of the state, and for a political form of Islam to be prevalent. Some are saying today, going back to one of the debates, that there is no compulsion in religion means that this is applied to Jews and Christians. So Jews and Christians in their countries, they can stay as long as they pay the tax. So they're going to some medieval tax, okay? Which of course doesn't happen. So you can see how some of these movements are trying to relive some past and bring it to the present. But please, always in the context of post-colonial history. Number 11. Some Islamists go further and say, we think that there is no compulsion in religion means that people can believe in any religion and live under an Islamist country. Wow, this sounds pretty liberal, but it doesn't, because it doesn't include people who don't believe in any religion. So they condemn the atheists, people with no religion. There is no place for them in this. Okay, so according to them, these atheists should be converted by force. You can see how this is beginning to be a bit paranoid and schizophrenic. Even more contradictory. Number 12. This is mostly the system in Iran. There's an Ayatollah who wrote a commentary of the Quran, and when he came to this verse, there is no compulsion in religion. He said, it is immoral to force someone to convert. It is wrong. You cannot do it. God cannot force someone to believe, and men cannot force anyone to believe. So far, so good. And yet, they say, we are here to fight for the restoration of an order based on religion. And if you don't accept that, we will convert you by force to Islam. So, very, very contradictory discourses. On the one hand, it is flirting a little bit with modernist ideas, with human rights. On the other hand, it brings the concept of the Islamic State, precisely because in that country, they have that state. That's specific of Iran. It doesn't happen in other countries. Number 13 is, of course, ISIS, which is, I would not call a interpretation, because they are not theologians and they are not commentators of the Quran. I have no words to describe them, except irrational. So, just to finish, what can we know about what the Quran really meant with this verse? So the answer is we cannot know what the Quran meant. Now, this is very bleak. We cannot know anything then. We can attempt a little bit. And if we look at the context, the previous text, and the following text that comes before and after, it is clear that this text is not a legal text. It's not a prescriptive text. It's not a norm. It's describing God. Right? So it seems as if later theologians read this text to their own advantage, in their own context, to promote a certain, either a certain state of things or to oppose a system that they wanted to combat. So Muslims have to acknowledge this variety of interpretations in their own history, and they have to acknowledge that dogmas change, that there is no such thing as this is in the Quran. It cannot be sustained. And Western non-Muslims must make an effort as well, that when Islam is being discussed and the Quran is being discussed, that they also have this in mind. Let me finish with one reflection, which is a quote from His Highness the Aga Khan in 2005, when he said, pluralism implies a readiness to listen to many voices, whether we agree with them or not, and a readiness to embrace a rich diversity of cultures. When our diversity divides us, the results can be tragic. But when we welcome diversity and the debate and dissent that goes with it, we sow the seeds of stability and progress. Finally, I would say that the Quran is a bit like a diamond. I know nothing about diamonds, but I know because my grandfather was involved in he was from Gujarat, and there was a diamond trade. And I know that diamonds are not pure. They're not found pure in the mountains. You have to mine them. And diamonds are found in rock. And this rock is called kimberlite. And scientists have discovered that, I did some Googling, I have to admit this. Scientists have discovered that the diamond is much older than the rock. Now, if for the diamond to be extracted, it has to be separated from the rock that has gone around it. In fact, diamonds are as old as the earth. That's the latest theory. And they have to be carefully observed, extracted, and polished. The Quran's pristine and universal beauty. Thank you.